The most meaningful decisions in your life will terrify you. Not because something is wrong with you, but because meaning always asks for more than comfort. The moments that shape a life don't arrive quietly. They arrive with doubt, with hesitation, with a strange tension in the chest that says, if you move forward, something familiar will be lost. Most people spend their lives trying to remove that feeling, to calm it, to distract themselves from it. Kierkegaard takes the opposite position. He treats fear as a sign that you are standing close to something real. When a choice matters, it shakes you. When it doesn't, it feels easy. That's the first truth that separates a meaningful life from a merely busy one. Kierkegaard is not interested in giving peace of mind. He doesn't offer strategies to feel better, to stay positive, or to smooth out life's rough edges. His philosophy is about pressure, inner pressure, the kind that appears when you realize that no one else can live your life for you. You can follow advice, imitate paths, and adopt beliefs, but eventually you reach a point where explanations stop working. At that point, the responsibility becomes personal. You are no longer hiding behind circumstances, expectations, or roles. You are standing alone with the knowledge that your life is yours to choose, and that no one can choose correctly in your place. That realization is unsettling, but it is also the beginning of seriousness. Meaning, for Kierkegaard, is not something you discover like a hidden object. It is something that forms when you commit yourself despite uncertainty. Fear appears first, because fear reveals freedom. You feel anxious not because you are incapable, but because multiple futures are open, and each one carries consequences. Choice then enters, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a repeated act. Every day you either choose consciously or drift unconsciously. Responsibility follows naturally. Once you choose, you can no longer blame the world in the same way. The weight of your life rests more firmly on your own shoulders, and that weight can feel heavy, but without it, life remains shallow. Becoming is the final movement in this journey. You don't become yourself through thinking alone or by waiting for clarity to arrive fully formed. You become through action taken under uncertainty, through staying loyal to a direction even when doubt remains. Kierkegaard understood that a human being is not finished by default. You are shaped over time by the choices you dare to stand behind. Fear does not disappear along the way. It matures. It changes from paralysis into seriousness, and slowly, through pressure and commitment, a life begins to feel like it belongs to the person living it. Fear and trembling is often misunderstood because many people approach it as a religious text or as an attempt to justify blind belief. That misses what Kierkegaard is actually doing. He takes the story of Abraham and Isaac and treats it like a psychological pressure test. He wants to know what happens inside a human being when a commitment becomes so absolute that language breaks down. The focus is not on rules, doctrines, or moral conclusions. The focus is on the inner experience of standing alone with a decision that defines your entire life. Kierkegaard is asking what it feels like to move forward when there is no argument that will protect you, no explanation that will make others understand, and no outcome that can be guaranteed. The book is about the inner weight of commitment, not its external justification. Abraham becomes interesting not because of what he does, but because of what he must carry while doing it. Kierkegaard draws a sharp line between the tragic hero and what he calls the knight of faith. A tragic hero sacrifices something precious, but the sacrifice makes sense within shared values. Society can understand it. The hero may suffer, but he is supported by meaning that exists outside of him. People can look at his actions and say, "I see why he did that." Abraham does not receive this kind of recognition. His situation cannot be translated into public language. There is no speech he can give that would make his choice appear noble or reasonable. From the outside, his action looks absurd, even horrifying. This is the point Kierkegaard keeps returning to. The knight of faith does not move forward with the protection of social approval or moral clarity. He steps into a position where misunderstanding is guaranteed. The cost of this kind of commitment is isolation. The moment meaning becomes personal in the deepest sense, it also becomes lonely. One of the most unsettling elements of fear and trembling is the emphasis on silence. Abraham cannot speak about what he is doing, not because he is forbidden to talk, but because speech would fail him. Words belong to the shared world. They are designed to explain actions in ways others can grasp. Abraham's situation has no such translation. If he speaks, he will be misunderstood. If he explains, his explanation will sound insane. Kierkegaard uses this silence to highlight something most people avoid facing. The most serious decisions in life are often made without witnesses. There is no jury, no reassurance, no feedback loop. You are left alone with your responsibility. Modern life encourages constant communication, constant validation, constant visibility. Kierkegaard shows a different reality. When a choice defines who you are, it usually happens quietly, internally, and without applause. Fear appears in this story as something unavoidable. Abraham's fear is not panic or weakness. It is the natural response of a human being who understands the stakes of his decision. Kierkegaard does not describe faith as calm or soothing. He describes it as trembling. This trembling comes from acting without guarantees. There is no contract that ensures things will work out. There is no safety net. Abraham moves forward without proof that his sacrifice will be redeemed. That uncertainty does not disappear through belief, it intensifies it. Kierkegaard insists on this point because many people confuse commitment with certainty. They assume that once a path is truly meaningful, doubt should vanish. Fear and trembling argues the opposite. The deeper the commitment, the more exposed you become. Fear is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that the decision actually matters. What makes this book timeless is how easily the story translates into ordinary life. You do not need a biblical context to experience an Abraham moment. It happens whenever you choose something that cannot be justified in advance. It happens when you step away from a path that looks sensible to everyone else, when you walk away from comfort without knowing where it leads, when you commit to something before you feel ready or confident. These moments are uncomfortable because they remove excuses. You can no longer say you were forced. You can no longer hide behind trends, expectations, or guarantees. The responsibility becomes personal. That is why people delay these decisions for years. It is easier to remain undecided than to stand behind a choice that defines you. Kierkegaard's deeper warning is subtle. A life without fear may appear stable, but it often lacks seriousness. When everything feels safe, predictable, and explainable, there is little at stake. Meaning grows where risk exists, where something important can be lost. This does not mean seeking danger for its own sake. It means recognizing that depth always carries tension. A meaningful relationship carries the risk of heartbreak. A meaningful pursuit carries the risk of failure. A meaningful life carries the risk of being misunderstood. Kierkegaard does not promise peace as a reward for commitment. He suggests something more demanding: integrity. To live in alignment with what you have chosen, even when fear remains. The final impression fear and trembling leaves is not inspiration in the usual sense. It leaves seriousness. It forces you to ask whether your life contains any decisions that truly belong to you. Decisions that were not optimized for approval, safety, or explanation. Decisions that required you to move forward while trembling. Kierkegaard does not glorify suffering, but he refuses to sanitize meaning. He shows that depth has a cost, and that cost is felt inwardly, not displayed outwardly. A life built entirely around comfort may look calm, but it often avoids the very experiences that shape a self. Meaning emerges when you accept the weight of choosing without certainty and remain faithful to that choice over time. If your choices never frighten you, you are probably not choosing your own life. Turning fear into a meaningful life does not begin with motivation or inspiration. It begins with honesty. The first task is to identify what Kierkegaard would call your Isaac. This is not a dramatic symbol meant to sound poetic. It is a very concrete question that most people avoid asking because they already sense the answer. What are you postponing because committing to it would cost you comfort, approval, or a familiar sense of safety? For some people, it is a career that looks respectable but feels empty. For others, it is a project that has been quietly waiting for years, untouched because starting it would remove the excuse of someday. For others, it is an honest admission about what they want or what they no longer want in a relationship, a lifestyle, or a version of themselves they have outgrown. Identifying your Isaac does not require courage yet. It only requires that you stop pretending you do not know where fear concentrates in your life. Fear is rarely spread evenly. It gathers around the one thing that would change everything if you took it seriously. Once that fear has a name, the next obstacle appears almost immediately. Waiting to feel ready, waiting for clarity, waiting for confidence. Kierkegaard understood this pattern long before it had modern labels. People tell themselves they are being careful, thoughtful, or responsible, when in reality they are postponing responsibility. Certainty feels like a reasonable requirement, but it functions as a delay mechanism. Life does not offer proof in advance for decisions that shape you. The feeling of readiness usually arrives after action has already begun. If you expect fear to disappear before you move, you place yourself in a permanent holding pattern. Fear does not vanish at the starting line. It changes shape as you walk forward. The practical rule is simple and uncomfortable. If you wait until fear is gone, nothing meaningful will happen. The door opens only after you step toward it. Commitment, when it becomes real, does not need an audience. One of the most important lessons from fear and trembling is the value of silence. In daily life, silence looks very different from ancient stories, but the principle remains the same. Choose one meaningful action and keep it private. Do not announce it. Do not explain it. Do not look for reassurance. This is not about secrecy for its own sake. It is about protecting the seriousness of the act. The moment you broadcast a commitment, it becomes exposed to opinions, reactions, and external pressure. Silence allows the action to belong fully to you. It removes the temptation to perform progress instead of making it. When you commit quietly, the work either happens or it doesn't. There is no applause to lean on, no identity boost to replace effort. This kind of commitment builds a different relationship with yourself. You learn whether you can be trusted when no one is watching. Anxiety will still appear, often more clearly than before. Instead of treating anxiety as something to fight or numb, Kierkegaard invites a different approach. Use it as a compass. Anxiety tends to show up at the edge of responsibility. It appears when a choice is close, when a step forward would reduce the number of available excuses. When anxiety rises, pause long enough to ask a better question. What choice is this pointing toward? What responsibility am I avoiding by staying still? Anxiety often arrives when something important is being delayed. It is not a command to stop. It is a signal that your life is asking something of you. Ignoring that signal does not make it disappear. It usually turns it into restlessness, distraction, or quiet dissatisfaction. Listening to it does not remove discomfort either, but it gives discomfort direction. Large commitments feel overwhelming because people imagine them as single, dramatic moments. In reality, most meaningful changes are built through repetition. This is where the idea of a daily micro-leap becomes powerful. Take the thing you are afraid to commit to and reduce it to an action small enough to repeat daily. One page written instead of a finished book. One application sent instead of a perfect plan. One honest conversation instead of a complete resolution. One disciplined habit instead of a total transformation. These actions may feel unimpressive, but they carry something essential: continuity. Meaning does not arrive through intensity alone. It grows when effort becomes regular. Each small action strengthens the connection between who you say you want to be and how you actually live. Over time, something subtle begins to change. Fear does not disappear, but it becomes familiar. It loses its ability to paralyze. The mind stops treating it as an emergency and starts treating it as part of the process. Confidence begins to form, not as a feeling, but as evidence. You trust yourself more because you have proof that you act even when it is uncomfortable. This trust is different from self-esteem built on praise or success. It is quieter. It comes from alignment. Your actions and intentions begin to match more often, and that reduces inner conflict. Life feels heavier in one sense because responsibility increases, but it also feels more solid. You know where you stand with yourself. Many people underestimate how much meaning depends on commitment rather than insight. Understanding ideas can feel productive, but understanding alone does not change how a life unfolds. Kierkegaard's challenge is practical at its core. He pushes you to move from reflection into action, even when reflection has not resolved every doubt. This does not mean acting recklessly or without thought. It means accepting that thought has limits. Some things only become clear after they are lived. Commitment creates a feedback loop that thinking alone cannot provide. Through action, your values stop being abstract and start shaping your days. As these steps repeat, a different relationship with fear develops. Fear no longer signals danger in the same way. It begins to signal significance. When fear appears, it often means something meaningful is nearby. This reframing does not make fear pleasant, but it makes it useful. Instead of asking how to eliminate fear, the question becomes how to move with it. Fear becomes part of the cost of living deliberately. Avoiding fear entirely often leads to a life that feels smooth on the surface and empty underneath. Engaging with fear, step by step, leads to a life that feels demanding but alive. The process does not end. Identifying your Isaac once does not complete the work. As life changes, new commitments appear and new fears follow them. Meaning is not a destination you reach and then keep forever. It is maintained through ongoing choice. Each phase of life asks different questions. What mattered before may no longer be enough. The same pattern repeats: fear, choice, responsibility, becoming. With practice, the pattern feels less chaotic. You recognize it when it appears. You understand that fear does not mean failure. It often means growth is approaching. In the end, these steps do not promise comfort. They offer something more durable, a sense that your life is shaped by your decisions rather than by avoidance. A sense that when you look at how you spend your time and energy, it reflects what matters to you. Meaning emerges quietly from that alignment. It does not announce itself. It is felt in the way effort feels justified even when it is hard. The work is not glamorous. It is repetitive, demanding, and often invisible. But over time, it creates a life that feels owned rather than endured. Kierkegaard's concern with the crowd is not political and not social in the ordinary sense. He is not attacking people for gathering, sharing ideas, or living together. His concern is existential. The crowd becomes dangerous when it replaces the individual's responsibility to think, choose, and stand behind a life. When truth belongs to everyone equally, it slowly loses its power to demand anything from anyone. It becomes vague, flexible, and easy to agree with. No one has to pay a personal price for it. In that sense, the crowd does not destroy truth by arguing against it. It dissolves truth by spreading it so thin that it no longer presses on the individual. What belongs to everyone ends up belonging to no one in particular. The crowd offers relief from responsibility. It provides ready-made explanations that soften the weight of choice. This is just how life is. becomes a way to avoid imagining alternatives. These phrases sound harmless, even realistic, but they slowly remove the individual from the center of their own life. Responsibility shifts outward. Decisions stop being personal and start feeling automatic. Kierkegaard saw this as one of the great dangers of modern life. When responsibility is shared too widely, it disappears. And when responsibility disappears, meaning follows it. The crowd also changes how people relate to themselves. Instead of asking, "What do I truly stand for?" the question becomes, "What makes sense according to others?" Life turns into a process of alignment rather than discovery. People adjust their values to fit what is acceptable, rewarded, or admired. Over time, this adjustment becomes invisible. It feels natural. You stop noticing that your opinions, goals, and priorities were shaped more by imitation than by choice. Kierkegaard believed this quiet drift was more dangerous than open conflict. At least conflict forces a position. Drift allows a life to pass without one. In the modern world, the crowd does not look like a physical mass of people. It exists through systems, metrics, and constant comparison. Social media turns approval into a visible number. Productivity culture turns worth into output. Trends move quickly, rewarding those who adapt fastest. None of these forces are inherently evil, but together they create an environment where external validation becomes the main reference point. When something is praised, shared, or rewarded, it feels real. When it is ignored, it feels meaningless. This environment trains people to outsource judgment. Instead of asking whether something is right, fulfilling, or true, the question becomes whether it performs well. This outsourcing happens gradually. At first, it looks like harmless inspiration. You follow what others are doing, learn from their paths, borrow their habits. Over time, inspiration becomes imitation. You begin choosing goals because they appear respectable, achievable, or admired. The internal compass weakens. Decisions are made to avoid falling behind, being misunderstood, or missing out. Kierkegaard would say that meaning cannot survive this process. Meaning requires that a person relate to their own life directly, without constantly checking whether it aligns with the crowd's expectations. One of the hardest truths in Kierkegaard's thought is that individuality often feels uncomfortable before it feels empowering. Standing alone does not initially feel like freedom. It feels like exposure. When you step away from the crowd, you lose its protection. You can no longer hide behind what is normal or expected. Your choices become visible to yourself in a sharper way. There is no collective excuse to lean on. This exposure is unsettling, which is why many people return quickly to the safety of shared opinions and shared paths. The crowd offers comfort through sameness. Individuality demands endurance. The crowd also affects how people interpret success and failure. When value is measured externally, success becomes something that can be displayed, compared, and ranked. Failure becomes something to hide. This creates a constant background pressure to appear competent, confident, and progressing. Kierkegaard's view of meaning has no patience for this performance. Meaning is not always visible. Many of the most important reveals in life happen inwardly. A person may look unchanged on the outside while undergoing a deep internal shift. The crowd has no way to recognize this. It values results, not alignment. That is why a meaningful life can look unimpressive from the outside, especially in its early stages. There is also a moral dimension to the crowd that Kierkegaard found troubling. When responsibility is diffused, accountability weakens. People feel less obligated to examine their actions deeply. Harmful patterns can persist simply because they are common. If something is widely accepted, it feels less urgent to question it. Kierkegaard believed that truth places demands on the individual, not on the group as a whole. You cannot live truth on behalf of others. You can only live it yourself. The crowd, by contrast, allows people to feel morally at ease without making difficult personal choices. From a personal development perspective, the cost of outsourcing values is subtle but profound. You may achieve goals that look impressive and still feel strangely detached from your own life. Effort feels exhausting rather than fulfilling. Progress feels hollow. This is often misdiagnosed as laziness, lack of gratitude, or a need for better motivation. Kierkegaard would diagnose it differently. When your values are borrowed rather than chosen, your actions lack inner grounding. You are moving, but you are not moving from yourself. Meaning cannot grow in that condition. Standing alone does not mean rejecting society, community, or influence altogether. It means reclaiming authorship over your life. It means allowing yourself to feel the discomfort of disagreement, uncertainty, and solitude. Before you can stand out, you must stand alone internally. This means forming convictions that are not immediately reinforced. It means tolerating the silence that comes when your path does not match familiar patterns. Kierkegaard believed that this stage is unavoidable. Many people want recognition without solitude, distinction without isolation. Meaning does not work that way. The inner work comes first. Over time, something interesting happens when you stop outsourcing your values. Decisions feel heavier but clearer. You spend less energy justifying yourself and more energy acting. You become less reactive to trends and more attentive to what actually sustains you. The crowd does not disappear, but its influence weakens. You can engage with it without being absorbed by it. Approval becomes pleasant rather than necessary. Disapproval becomes tolerable rather than threatening. This shift does not make life easier, but it makes it more coherent. Your actions begin to align with your sense of self more often. Kierkegaard understood that meaning is fragile in a world that rewards conformity. It requires protection. It requires that you periodically step back and ask whether your life reflects your own commitments or someone else's expectations. The crowd will always offer shortcuts, explanations, and reassurance. It will always promise that you are fine as long as you follow along. The individual path offers no such guarantees. It asks for responsibility, patience, and courage. Meaning grows in that tension. The crowd erases meaning by smoothing out differences and dulling responsibility. The individual restores meaning by accepting the weight of choice. This restoration does not happen in a single moment. It unfolds through repeated acts of standing alone, thinking carefully, and choosing deliberately. The reward is not constant happiness or admiration. The reward is a life that feels internally anchored, a life where effort feels connected to purpose, a life that even when difficult feels genuinely yours. Anxiety enters a life at the moment certainty weakens. It does not appear only when something goes wrong. It often appears when something opens up. Kierkegaard noticed that people tend to feel anxious not when their lives are completely trapped, but when they sense that change is possible. The thought, "I could live differently," carries a strange tension. It sounds hopeful on the surface, yet it unsettles the mind. Possibility introduces responsibility. Once you realize that another life is possible, staying where you are becomes a choice rather than a fate. Anxiety grows in that gap between what is and what could be. It is the emotional response to openness. Kierkegaard described this experience as the dizziness of freedom. The image is precise. Standing at the edge of a high place, the body reacts not only to the risk of falling, but to the awareness that movement is possible. The dizziness does not come from the height alone. It comes from realizing that you are free to move and that your movement would have consequences. Freedom disorients the mind because it removes the illusion of inevitability. When life feels fixed, anxiety often hides beneath routine. When life feels open, anxiety rises to the surface. The mind struggles to stabilize itself when outcomes are no longer predetermined. Many people interpret anxiety as a personal flaw. They assume it means something is broken, that they are incapable of handling life properly. Kierkegaard saw something different. Anxiety appears when a person stands before possibility. It shows up when the future is not fully written. The mind prefers predictability, even when predictability is unsatisfying. Freedom disrupts that preference. It forces the mind to acknowledge uncertainty and choice. Anxiety becomes the emotional expression of that disruption. It is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence that life is still in motion. Anxiety often intensifies when familiar structures begin to loosen. A job no longer feels right. A relationship feels misaligned. A way of living starts to feel narrow. These moments are rarely dramatic. They arrive quietly, as unease, restlessness, or a sense that something is unfinished. The realization that things could change brings relief and fear at the same time. Relief because stagnation has been exposed. Fear because movement demands responsibility. The mind tries to regain control by seeking reassurance, certainty, or distraction. Kierkegaard understood this impulse, but he warned against letting it dominate. Anxiety, when treated only as something to eliminate, pushes people back into closed lives. The mind often responds to anxiety by asking for guarantees. It wants clear outcomes, fixed identities, and stable paths. It wants to know exactly what will happen before it moves. Freedom does not provide that information. Freedom offers choice without complete clarity. Anxiety emerges from that imbalance. The mind wants closure, while life offers openness. This tension cannot be resolved through thought alone. It can only be navigated through engagement. Kierkegaard believed that trying to eliminate anxiety completely leads to a smaller life. People trade possibility for comfort. Over time, comfort turns into dullness, and dullness turns into quiet despair. Anxiety also exposes how much of life is built on habit rather than intention. When routines dominate, days blur together. Decisions feel automatic. Anxiety remains muted because nothing is being questioned. When reflection enters, anxiety wakes up. Questions arise. Why am I doing this? What would happen if I stopped? What else could I become? These questions destabilize the familiar structure of the self. Anxiety accompanies that destabilization. It is the emotional sign that identity is no longer rigid. Kierkegaard saw this flexibility as necessary for becoming. A self that never feels anxiety is often a self that has stopped growing. Reframing anxiety requires patience. The instinct to suppress it is strong. Modern culture encourages constant soothing. Distraction, entertainment, and productivity fill the space where anxiety might otherwise speak. Kierkegaard's approach asks for the opposite. Instead of silencing anxiety, listen to what it reveals. Anxiety points to the areas of life where freedom is pressing for attention. It highlights the places where choice still exists. When anxiety appears, something important is unsettled. The task is not to panic or retreat, but to observe. What possibility has entered awareness? What assumption has loosened its grip? Anxiety becomes overwhelming when it remains abstract. Vague fear feels infinite. When anxiety is grounded in specific questions, it becomes more manageable. Instead of experiencing anxiety as a general threat, it can be understood as information. It signals that life is asking for a response. This does not mean every anxious impulse should be acted upon immediately. It means anxiety deserves interpretation rather than dismissal. Kierkegaard believed that anxiety educates the individual. It teaches the weight of freedom. It reveals that choices matter. Without anxiety, freedom would feel trivial. Anxiety gives freedom seriousness. As people begin to engage with anxiety differently, its texture changes. It may remain present, but it no longer dominates in the same way. It becomes familiar. Instead of signaling danger, it signals transition. Anxiety marks the edge between what is known and what is possible. Living without anxiety would require living without openness. That kind of life may feel stable, but it limits growth. Kierkegaard did not celebrate anxiety for its own sake. He treated it as an unavoidable companion to freedom. Learning to walk with it is part of becoming an individual. Anxiety also challenges the idea that identity is fixed. Many people introduce themselves through roles, labels, and past decisions. Anxiety disrupts those definitions. It raises the question of whether identity is still unfolding. The thought that you are not finished can feel unsettling. It removes the comfort of final answers. Kierkegaard believed that becoming oneself is a lifelong task. Anxiety appears when that task becomes visible again. It reminds you that life is not complete. This reminder can feel heavy, but it also keeps the self alive. Avoiding anxiety often leads to rigid identities. People cling to certainty even when it no longer fits. They stay in roles that no longer reflect who they are becoming. Anxiety threatens those roles, which is why it feels dangerous. Kierkegaard would say that resisting anxiety too strongly often deepens inner conflict. The self knows change is needed, but the mind refuses to engage. This tension produces restlessness, numbness, or constant distraction. Anxiety is the initial signal. Ignoring it does not remove the underlying need for change. When anxiety is accepted as part of freedom, it begins to serve a different function. It becomes a guide rather than an enemy. It draws attention to choices that matter. It highlights where growth is possible. This does not make decisions easy. It makes them honest. Anxiety strips away illusions of control. It forces acknowledgement of uncertainty. Kierkegaard believed that facing this uncertainty with seriousness leads to a more grounded life. Decisions made in the presence of anxiety tend to be more deliberate. They carry weight. They shape character over time. An open life remains unpredictable. Anxiety will return in different forms as new possibilities emerge. The task is not to eliminate it permanently, but to recognize its meaning. Anxiety signals that life is not closed, that paths are still available, that becoming is ongoing. It reveals that existence is not finished. Kierkegaard saw this openness as a gift, even though it is uncomfortable. A fixed life may feel calm, but it lacks depth. An open life carries tension, but it also carries meaning. Anxiety, understood this way, becomes a companion rather than an obstacle. It reminds you that your life is not predetermined. It confirms that choice still matters. It keeps you alert to the reality that you are participating in your own becoming. When anxiety appears, it does not announce failure. It announces possibility. It says that the future is not locked in place. It says that something important is still undecided. That undecided space is where freedom lives. The dizziness of freedom does not fade entirely. It becomes part of the background of a serious life. Those who learn to tolerate it without fleeing begin to move differently. They act with more intention. They rely less on external validation. They accept that uncertainty is part of living honestly. Anxiety no longer controls them, but it continues to inform them. It keeps life from becoming mechanical. It keeps meaning within reach. Anxiety is the price of possibility. Paying that price does not guarantee success or happiness. It guarantees engagement. It keeps life open rather than sealed. Kierkegaard's insight remains simple and demanding. When anxiety appears, something in your life is still alive. Something still needs to be chosen. The task is not to escape that feeling, but to meet it with awareness and courage. Despair, as Kierkegaard understands it, hides behind normality. It does not always announce itself through tears, crisis, or collapse. Often it lives inside lives that look perfectly fine from the outside. A person can wake up on time, go to work, maintain relationships, meet expectations, and still carry a quiet sense that something is wrong. This wrongness is difficult to name because nothing is obviously broken. Life functions. Responsibilities are met. Yet beneath the surface there is a feeling of distance from oneself, as if life is happening slightly off-center. Kierkegaard calls this despair. Not sadness, not depression in the clinical sense, but misalignment. A life lived out of sync with the self that could have been. This kind of despair is hard to detect because it often feels normal. Many people assume that a low-level dissatisfaction is simply part of adult life. They interpret it as fatigue, stress, or a lack of gratitude. Kierkegaard would argue that despair becomes dangerous precisely when it blends into routine. When despair is loud, it demands attention. When it is quiet, it becomes permanent. The tragedy is not that people suffer openly, but that they adapt silently to lives that do not belong to them. Over time, this adaptation dulls desire, curiosity, and inner movement. Life becomes manageable but flat. One of the most unsettling aspects of despair is that success does not protect against it. Recognition, status, and achievement can coexist with deep misalignment. A person may be admired for their discipline, intelligence, or productivity, while internally feeling detached from what they are doing. Kierkegaard saw this clearly. When identity is built primarily around external roles, the inner self weakens. Applause reinforces behavior, not alignment. The more a person is rewarded for a path they did not consciously choose, the harder it becomes to question it. Despair deepens quietly because questioning would threaten the structure that now defines them. Despair often grows from avoided commitment. When people postpone serious choices, they tell themselves they are keeping options open. In reality, time begins to close those options without consent. Avoidance feels safe in the short term, it reduces immediate pressure, but over time it erodes agency. Life fills itself in around what is not chosen. Kierkegaard believed that refusing to choose is itself a choice, one that hands responsibility over to circumstance. Despair appears when a person realizes, often too late, that their life was shaped more by inertia than intention. Living through others' expectations is another common source of despair. Expectations are not always imposed aggressively. They often arrive gently, wrapped in advice, concern, or tradition. People internalize them early: what is sensible, what is respectable, what leads to security. Over time, these expectations become indistinguishable from personal desire. Kierkegaard warned that this confusion is dangerous. When a person mistakes inherited values for chosen ones, the self becomes divided. Actions continue, but they are no longer rooted. Effort feels heavy, motivation fades. The person may blame themselves for lacking discipline, without recognizing that discipline cannot sustain a life that was never truly owned. Refusing responsibility for one's own becoming is perhaps the deepest form of despair. This refusal does not always look dramatic. It often looks like resignation. Phrases like "this is just how I am" or "this is how life works" act as protective barriers. They shield the person from the discomfort of change. Kierkegaard saw these attitudes as spiritual avoidance. Becoming oneself requires effort, risk, and patience. It requires accepting that life will not simply happen correctly on its own. Despair settles in when people wait passively for fulfillment, hoping it will arrive without demanding transformation. Kierkegaard described despair as a misrelation to the self. This phrase sounds abstract, but its meaning is concrete. The self is not something static that you either have or lack. It is something you relate to through your choices. When choices reflect your deeper values, the relationship strengthens. When choices consistently contradict them, the relationship weakens. Despair grows in that weakening. The person may not consciously know what they want, but they feel the strain of living against themselves. This strain shows up as restlessness, irritability, numbness, or constant distraction. Life feels full, but empty at the same time. Resolution, for Kierkegaard, does not come through chasing happiness. Happiness is too fragile and too dependent on circumstances. A good mood cannot repair a life built on misalignment. Meaning addresses despair differently. Meaning grows when actions reflect inner commitments. When what you do and what you value begin to overlap more consistently, despair loosens its grip. This process does not remove difficulty. It often introduces new challenges, but the difficulty feels justified. Effort starts to make sense again. Even struggle feels connected to something real. Alignment requires honesty. It asks uncomfortable questions. What am I doing that no longer reflects who I am becoming? Where am I performing rather than living? What responsibilities have I avoided because they would require change? These questions do not have quick answers. Kierkegaard did not offer techniques for instant clarity. He emphasized seriousness. Taking your life seriously means accepting that some forms of comfort must be sacrificed. It means acknowledging that becoming yourself may disrupt relationships, routines, and identities that once felt stable. Becoming yourself is painful because it involves loss. You lose familiar versions of yourself. You lose certain forms of approval. You lose the ease of blending in. Kierkegaard did not minimize this pain. He believed it was unavoidable. Growth reshapes the self, and reshaping always involves friction. The pain is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of transition. What makes this pain bearable is its direction. It moves toward alignment rather than away from it. Not becoming yourself carries a different kind of pain. It accumulates slowly and silently. It shows up as regret, bitterness, or a sense of wasted time. This pain is harder to confront because it has no clear turning point. It stretches across years. Kierkegaard believed this was the greater tragedy. A life that avoids the pain of becoming often inherits the pain of stagnation. The difference is subtle but profound. One pain leads somewhere, the other lingers without resolution. Alignment does not mean perfection. It does not mean complete clarity or constant confidence. It means that your actions increasingly reflect what you consider meaningful. Small shifts matter, choosing honesty over convenience, choosing effort over avoidance, choosing responsibility over excuses. These choices rebuild the relationship with the self gradually. Despair weakens as alignment strengthens. Life does not become easy, but it becomes coherent. You understand why you are doing what you are doing. Kierkegaard believed that despair can only be overcome from the inside. No external success, relationship, or recognition can substitute for alignment. Others may admire your life, but admiration cannot resolve inner division. Resolution comes when you accept the task of becoming as ongoing. There is no final version of the self to reach. There is only continued responsibility for how you live. This responsibility can feel heavy, but it also restores dignity. You are no longer waiting for life to make sense. You are participating in its formation. As alignment grows, despair loses its quiet authority. It may return at times, signaling new misalignments or postponed decisions. This does not mean progress has been undone. It means the process continues. Becoming yourself is not a one-time achievement. It is a repeated commitment. Each phase of life asks new questions. Each question invites either avoidance or engagement. Meaning deepens when engagement becomes the habit. In the end, despair teaches something essential. It reveals where life has drifted away from the self. It points toward neglected responsibilities and unchosen paths. When listened to carefully, despair becomes informative rather than paralyzing. It signals that something important has been ignored. Meaning responds by restoring alignment, not through pleasure or ease, but through seriousness and commitment. Becoming yourself costs something. Refusing that cost costs more. Fear has followed this entire journey for a reason. It appears at the beginning, when possibility first opens. It stays present when commitment becomes unavoidable. It deepens when responsibility settles in. Kierkegaard never treats fear as a mistake. He treats it as a companion to meaning. A life without fear may feel calm, but it rarely feels alive. Fear is the signal that something important is at stake. When you allow yourself to face it rather than escape it, fear stops being a barrier and becomes a marker. It shows you where your life is asking for seriousness. Commitment is the moment where thinking ends and living begins. It is easy to admire meaningful lives from a distance. It is harder to commit to one when certainty is absent. Kierkegaard understood that no explanation can protect you here. Once you choose, the weight becomes yours. There are no guarantees, no crowds to hide behind, no outcomes promised in advance. Commitment narrows your options, and that narrowing can feel suffocating at first. Yet without it, life remains scattered. Commitment gathers your energy. It turns intention into direction. It gives fear a place to move rather than letting it spread everywhere. Responsibility follows naturally. When you commit, you stop blaming circumstances as easily. You begin to see your life as something you are shaping rather than something that is happening to you. Responsibility is heavy, but it also restores dignity. You are no longer waiting for meaning to arrive. You are participating in its creation. Kierkegaard believed that this acceptance of responsibility is where a person begins to stand upright inside their own life. You may still struggle, doubt, and fail, but those experiences feel different when they belong to choices you made consciously. Meaning grows slowly out of this process. It does not arrive as constant happiness or peace. It shows itself in alignment. Your actions begin to match what matters to you. Effort feels justified. Even difficulty feels connected to something real. Meaning is not loud. It does not announce itself. It becomes visible in how you carry your days, how you make decisions, how you respond to fear rather than avoiding it. The question is not whether fear will appear in your life. It will. The question is whether you will let it guide you toward commitment or push you back into comfort. Kierkegaard's challenge remains simple and demanding. Your life will never feel meaningful until you risk it becoming real. So take a moment and be honest with yourself. What is one leap you know you're avoiding?